Today we will be looking at 3 horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. A split second is all it took for all 3 of them to go from nothing to unsettling. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On May 28, 1967, a group of 6 adventurers embarked on what was intended to be a routine journey into Breathing Cave, nestled in Bath County, Virginia. The party consisted of Phil Gettle, 25, his brother Lee, 23, Jim Young, 17, Fred Chiara, 15, Dale Ibison, 20, and Jay Herbane, 33. While the cave was a familiar terrain for most, Fred and Jim were relatively new to its intricacies. The group set out at 12:30 p.m., brimming with anticipation. Their objective? To navigate the new section of the cave and reach a waterfall hidden deep within. The initial trek was straightforward. The group moved cautiously, their headlamps casting shifting beams of light across the rugged limestone walls. They paused occasionally to marvel at the intricate formations that adorned the cave, stalactites hanging like frozen daggers and stalagmites rising like ancient sentinels. As the group explored side passages, their laughter and light-hearted chatter filled the otherwise silent cavern. Fred, the youngest in the group, seemed particularly captivated. His inexperience showed in his careful movements, but his enthusiasm was infectious. After an hour and a half of steady progress, the group arrived at Cathedral Passage, a 300-foot-long corridor with towering walls that vanished into darkness above. This passage, with its dramatic height and imposing scale, was a highlight of the cave, but it also presented a choice. 2 routes could be taken: a lower path involving tight crawls through eel-like passages, or an upper route requiring canyon hopping and some technical climbing. Despite the risks, the group decided on the upper route, a decision that would soon prove fatal. The climb was challenging but exhilarating. The party moved methodically, using ledges on either side of the canyon for footholds and handholds. Phil led the way, his experience evident in his confident movements. Behind him, Jay guided Fred and Jim, offering words of encouragement. Fred was notably cautious, his breaths audible as he navigated the narrow ledges. At one point, he hesitated, his hand trembling as it hovered over a slippery protrusion. Jay noticed and called back, reminding Fred to stay focused. By 2 p.m., most of the group had reached the end of the passage. Jim and Fred remained midway, with Jim ahead. Fred, straddling the canyon, used the ledges on either side to maintain his balance. The air in the passage felt heavy, and the only sound was the rhythmic crunch of boots against rock and the occasional clink of gear. It was a tense moment, one that demanded unwavering focus. Fred was carefully making his way along the narrow ledge, each movement deliberate and cautious. His breathing was steady, though strained, as he focused on the unforgiving drop below. His hands gripped the rough stone tightly, the jagged edges biting into his palms. Just as he shifted his weight to his left foot, disaster struck. A loose rock crumbled beneath him. It happened too fast for anyone to react. His body jolted, his balance betrayed, and the world seemed to tilt. For a fleeting instant, his arms flailed, clawing at empty air, and then he was gone, plunging into the darkness below. Fred's fall was sudden and silent. One moment, he was carefully inching forward, his hands gripping the rough rock, and the next, he slipped. A faint was all that escaped his lips as he disappeared below. Dale, positioned nearby, saw the fall but was helpless to intervene. Chaos erupted as the group scrambled to assess the situation. Phil and Lee immediately descended to Fred, finding him motionless and severely injured. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the rocky floor. His breaths were faint, shallow gasps, and his limbs lay at unnatural angles. Phil placed a trembling hand on Fred's chest, feeling the faint rise and fall. It was clear Fred was gravely injured. Jay volunteered to head to the surface to summon help. The journey out of the cave was grueling as he pushed himself through tight passages and ascended steep climbs. Upon reaching the surface, Jay flagged down another group of cavers and instructed them to contact the Potomac Speleological Club and the Cave Rescue Communications Network. He returned with a rope, a blanket, and a plastic sheet, knowing that time was against them. Meanwhile, those who remained with Fred did what they could to make him comfortable. Phil cradled Fred's head, speaking softly to him, though it was unclear if Fred could hear. The minutes dragged into hours, and Fred's breathing grew weaker. At 4:15 p.m., his chest stopped moving entirely. Phil checked for a pulse, but found none. Artificial respiration was attempted, but it was futile. Fred was gone. The rescue team arrived shortly after 5 p.m., bringing additional equipment and manpower. The task of recovering Fred's body was arduous. The narrow, jagged passages of Breathing Cave made transport incredibly difficult, and the process of maneuvering the stretcher through the cave system was slow and physically demanding. By 11:45 p.m., Fred's body was finally brought to the surface, his friends and the rescue team exhausted and grief-stricken. The coroner later confirmed that Fred had suffered a fatal concussion, along with a possible broken neck, internal injuries, a fractured wrist, and a dislocated leg. The lack of head protection in the helmet he wore likely contributed to the severity of his injuries. His death raised serious questions within the caving community. Were novices being pushed too far too soon? Were some caves, like Breathing Cave, underestimated in their risks? This next story is even more claustrophobic than the previous one. On April 18, 2004, Aaron Stockton and Jim Burke set out to explore a cave newly discovered near the Dark Canyon Lookout Tower in New Mexico. As experienced explorers, they had spent years chasing the thrill of the unknown, venturing into dark, uncharted caverns. The idea of being one of the first humans to set foot in a cave, untouched for millennia, was irresistible. They arrived at the cave in the late afternoon. It was a modest, unassuming opening in the rocky terrain, partially obscured by loose rubble. The sun was low, so they knew they didn't have much time before nightfall, but decided they could at least get a look inside. Burke volunteered to go first. He was lean and had more experience with tight squeezes, so he thought he could navigate the narrow opening without much trouble. It further led to a downward shaft that eventually opened to a vast network of tunnels. As Burke worked his way down, a cascade of small stones tumbled loose, causing the two men to pause. This wasn't unusual. Caving often involves unstable ground, but the rocks didn't stop. A moment later, a loud crack echoed through the air as the ground shifted. Before Burke could react, 3 large rocks dislodged and slammed down into the hole behind him. The air filled with dust, choking the narrow passage. Burke instinctively pressed himself against the cramped walls of the cave as the rocks crashed down, missing him by mere inches. He could feel the vibration of the impact through the stone, the sound reverberating in the small space. For a terrifying moment, he thought the entire entrance would cave in and bury him alive. When the dust settled, Burke found himself immobilized, the massive rocks that had sealed the passage and left no room to escape. He was trapped in a tight, damp space, in a sitting position, with back against the cave wall and one of the 3 boulders just a few centimeters away from his face. His heart pounded as he assessed his situation. Miraculously, despite the violence of the collapse, he was unscathed. The rocks had fallen just a few inches enough away to spare him, a stroke of fortune he wouldn't fully grasp until later. For a moment, Stockton stood frozen, staring at the blocked entrance in disbelief. Then, adrenaline kicked in. He dropped to his knees and began clawing at the rubble, pulling away smaller rocks to assess the situation. He called out Burke, hoping for a response. A muffled voice came through after a tense few seconds, telling him he's unharmed. Hearing that Burke was uninjured was a relief, but the situation was dire. Burke might be alive and unharmed for now, but the way out was completely blocked, and any further movement of the unstable debris could spell disaster, crushing him. The race to save his friend had begun. Stockton quickly got to work, using his hands and whatever tools he had to create an opening. He managed to clear a hole just big enough to pass sound through, 6 inches by 12 inches. Through it, they could communicate. Burke assured Stockton that he wasn't hurt, but he couldn't move in the tight space. The air was damp and cool, and he'd started to feel the chill creeping in. Stockton knew he couldn't free Burke alone. The rocks blocking the passage were too large to move without equipment, and there was no way to ensure the remaining debris wouldn't collapse further. Thinking quickly, Stockton found some tree branches nearby and used them to stabilize the precarious rocks above the entrance. The last thing they needed was another collapse. He promised Burke he would get help and set off for the Dark Canyon Lookout Tower, hiking as fast as he could over the rugged terrain. The hike was grueling, the evening air cold and sharp, but Stockton pressed on, determined to save his friend. By the time he reached help, night had fallen. The search and rescue team assessed the situation and made a critical decision. Attempting a rescue in the dark would be risky. The entrance was unstable, and rushing to act could put rescuers in harm's way. They decided to wait until morning, when conditions would be safer. Still, Stockton couldn't bear the thought of leaving Burke alone in the cold all night. He gathered a small team of volunteers and essential supplies, food, water, blankets, and they began the trek back to the cave. The hike took 2 hours through uneven, rocky terrain. By midnight, they reached the entrance. Using a long stick, they carefully pushed the supplies through the small opening Stockton had made earlier. Burke was grateful for the provisions and reported that he was cold, but otherwise in good spirits. The team stayed near the entrance, keeping watch through the night. All they could do now was wait for daylight and the arrival of more help. At first light on April 19th, the main rescue operation began. About 30 people, a mix of volunteer cavers and trained rescuers, gathered at the site. The team carefully evaluated the situation, deciding that shoring, the process of reinforcing the walls of the cave, was unnecessary. However, the effort to remove the blockage would be no small task. The massive boulders, each weighing over 300 pounds, stood between Burke and freedom. The rescuers began by clearing away the smaller rocks by hand, slowly widening the entrance. It was tedious, back-breaking work, but everyone was focused on the goal. The larger boulders required a combination of ingenuity and brute strength. Using bolt anchors, a come-along, a hand-operated winch, and sheer muscle power, they managed to move the first boulder out of the way. The second boulder proved even more stubborn. Every shift of the rock threatened to destabilize the surrounding debris, and the team had to proceed with extreme caution. Hours passed as they inched it free. The wind picked up, with gusts reaching 50 miles per hour, adding another layer of difficulty. A National Guard helicopter that had been on standby was called off due to the weather, leaving the rescuers entirely on their own. By late morning, the final obstacle was removed. Stockton was at the front of the group when Burke finally emerged from the darkness, blinking against the bright sunlight. He was covered in dirt and visibly exhausted, but unharmed. Cheers and relieved smiles spread through the group. The ordeal had lasted nearly 20 hours, but Burke was safe. The rescue team helped Burke gather his strength, and together they began the 2-hour hike back to the dark canyon lookout tower. Despite their fatigue, the sense of accomplishment buoyed their spirits. By 4:30 p.m., the last of the rescuers had packed up and headed home. For Stockton and Burke, the experience was a wake-up call. Lost Fossil Cave may not have claimed a life that day, but it left a lasting mark on everyone involved. The last story is as terrifying as the other two. It was late on a Wednesday evening, December 1st, 2004, when two men, both in their mid-20s, decided to explore Devil's Punchbowl in Guam. The pit, located in a land trust preserve near the Hilton Resort, was infamous among locals. Stories of its sheer 50-foot drop, jagged walls, and eerie atmosphere made it a tempting spot for thrill seekers. That night, curiosity got the better of them. The preserve's gate, meant to keep people out, was unlocked. Whether it was carelessness or deliberate neglect, no one knows, but it was enough to set the stage for disaster. Armed with nothing but their phones for light, the two ventured into the preserve. They had no caving equipment, no ropes, helmets, or even flashlights. It was a reckless choice, but at that moment, it probably felt like an adventure. The night was heavy and silent, the kind of stillness that makes every sound unnervingly loud. As they approached the pit, the faint glow of their phone screens barely illuminated the rocky terrain. Devil's Punchbowl loomed before them like a gaping maw in the earth. The jagged edges of the pit seemed to warn them to stay away. But instead, they stepped closer. One of the men, his name was never shared in the reports, decided he wanted to climb down. Maybe it was the thrill of the unknown, or maybe he thought it wouldn't be that difficult. Whatever his reasoning, it was a choice he wouldn't live to regret. He stepped to the edge, testing the loose, uneven rocks with his sneakers. The other man stood back, unsure, but didn't stop him. The descent started cautiously. The climber gripped the rocks, his fingers searching for holds in the dark. With no proper gear, he relied entirely on his balance and the friction of his shoes against the stone. His companion watched from above, holding his breath every time a rock crumbled beneath the climber's weight and tumbled into the pit. Then, it happened. The man slipped. Maybe he misjudged the hold, or perhaps the rocks gave way. No one will ever know for sure. For a split second he tried to recover, scrambling for grip on the crumbling wall, but gravity had already taken over. His companion could only watch in horror as he plummeted into the darkness. The sound of the fall was gut-wrenching. It wasn't just the dull thud at the bottom. It was the sickening silence that followed. The other man called out desperately, but there was no answer. Just the echo of his own voice bouncing back from the walls of the pit. Panic set in. His heart raced as he stared into the black void below, knowing he couldn't do anything to help. With shaking hands, he turned and ran, stumbling over rocks and roots in the dark. The preserve seemed endless, the path twisting and unfamiliar. Every second felt like an eternity as he searched for help. Finally, he spotted a security guard patrolling near the Hilton Resort. He waved him down and then explained the situation. The guard, alarmed by his panic, quickly radioed the police. Within minutes, rescuers were dispatched to Devil's Punchbowl. By the time the rescue team arrived, it was clear that this would not be a rescue, but a recovery. The team, experienced in dealing with such situations, brought ropes, harnesses, and lights to illuminate the pit. As they set up their equipment, the man's companion stood nearby, shaking and staring blankly at the ground. The guilt and helplessness were written all over his face. When the team descended into the pit, the scene at the bottom was grim. The man had fallen over 50 feet onto jagged rocks, sustaining catastrophic injuries. He had died on impact, sparing him any prolonged suffering, but leaving an indelible mark on everyone involved. Carefully, the rescuers secured his body and brought him back to the surface. The process was slow and methodical, the weight of the tragedy heavy on their shoulders. When they finally emerged from the pit, the reality of what had happened was impossible to ignore. The authorities later confirmed that the man's name, along with his companions, was withheld from public reports. Perhaps it was out of respect for the family's privacy, or an effort to prevent further scrutiny of the incident. Regardless, the anonymity didn't lessen the weight of the loss. An official responsible for the property spoke about the tragedy, emphasizing that Devil's Punchbowl was not open to the public and that the gate should have been locked. But that explanation felt hollow. It didn't bring the man back, nor did it erase the pain of those left behind. For those involved, that night was a haunting reminder of how quickly things can go wrong when the risks are underestimated. Devil's Punchbowl, with its stark, unforgiving depths, had claimed another life. The preserve remained silent as ever, indifferent to the tragedy it had witnessed.